Section 22, Commissions in the Contract. Introduction, agency and compensation must work together. Throughout this course, we have discussed agency disclosure, buyer representation, procuring cause, dual agency, and the importance of documenting relationships. One of the biggest changes in today's real estate market is that agency and compensation discussions can no longer be treated as separate conversations. In the past, many buyer agents relied on compensation being offered through the MLS. Today, compensation must be discussed, negotiated, and documented more carefully than ever before. Buyers deserve to understand how their agent is being paid. Sellers deserve transparency regarding compensation requests, and brokers need clear documentation to avoid disputes. This is why understanding commissions in the contract has become such an important part of modern agency practice. The buyer-broker agreement comes first. Everything begins with the buyer-broker agreement. Before discussing compensation with a seller, before negotiating compensation in a contract, and before showing homes, the buyer and broker should establish their relationship in writing. The buyer-broker agreement explains the services the broker will provide, the duration of the relationship, and how compensation will be handled. Most importantly, it establishes the buyer's obligation regarding compensation if a property is purchased. This is one reason we spent so much time earlier in this course discussing buyer representation agreements. Agency and compensation work together. Without a buyer-broker agreement, the buyer's broker may have difficulty enforcing compensation rights later. The market has changed. Historically, buyer agents often knew exactly what compensation was being offered because the information was displayed through MLS systems. Today's environment is different. The buyer's broker must now negotiate compensation directly as part of the transaction. This means compensation conversations are occurring much earlier and much more frequently than they did in the past. Buyers are asking questions. Sellers are evaluating requests. Brokers are documenting compensation through separate agreements and addenda. The result is greater transparency, but also greater responsibility. The Seller Compensation Addendum. One of the most important tools available to buyer agents today is the Seller Compensation Addendum. This form allows the buyer and seller to negotiate compensation for the buyer's broker directly within the transaction. The addendum becomes part of the contract and establishes the seller's agreement to pay compensation at closing. The compensation may be expressed as a percentage of the purchase price or as a flat dollar amount. The purpose of the form is straightforward. It documents the agreement between the parties regarding buyer-broker compensation, provides written consent for payment through escrow, and establishes the buyer's broker as a third-party beneficiary of the agreement. Real-world example, the FSBO transaction. Imagine you are representing a buyer interested in a for-sale-by-owner property. There is no listing broker. There is no pre-arranged compensation agreement. Your buyer has signed a buyer-broker agreement, and you have spent considerable time assisting with showings, negotiations, disclosures, inspections, and financing coordination. How do you get paid? A common solution is to negotiate compensation directly with the seller through a seller compensation addendum. If the seller agrees, the compensation becomes part of the contract and is paid through escrow at closing. This approach allows the transaction to proceed while ensuring the compensation agreement is fully documented. What if the seller says no? One of the most common questions agents ask is, what happens if the seller refuses to pay my commission? The answer depends on the buyer-broker agreement. If the buyer has agreed to compensate the broker and the seller declines to contribute, the buyer may remain responsible for the agreed compensation. The parties may also renegotiate the fee, modify the agreement, or explore other solutions. This is why compensation should be discussed with buyers at the beginning of the relationship, not at the closing table. Surprises create disputes. Transparency creates trust. A shared compensation scenario. Not every transaction involves the seller paying the full amount of the buyer-broker compensation. In some situations, the seller may agree to contribute a portion of the compensation while the buyer agrees to pay the remainder. The key is ensuring that the arrangement is fully disclosed, agreed upon, and documented in writing. The important lesson is that compensation can be flexible, but documentation should never be optional. Commission reductions and saving the deal. Real estate transactions rarely go exactly as planned. Sometimes inspection issues arise. Sometimes repair negotiations become difficult. Sometimes one of the parties asks the broker to reduce compensation to help keep the transaction together. Can a commission be reduced? Absolutely. However, commission changes should never be handled casually. The course material explains that commission modifications should be approved by the broker. documented in writing, and communicated to escrow when necessary. This protects everyone involved and ensures the closing documents accurately reflect the final agreement. Real-world example: helping a transaction close. Imagine a buyer and seller are arguing over repairs. The seller refuses to make additional concessions, and the buyer is considering canceling the transaction. To help bridge the gap, the buyer's broker offers to reduce compensation slightly. The broker discusses the situation with the designated broker, obtains approval, prepares the appropriate documentation, and provides updated instructions to escrow. The transaction closes. The buyer obtains the property. The seller completes the sale. The broker remains compliant. This is a perfect example of why compensation changes should always be documented. The importance of broker approval. One of the most overlooked compensation issues involves broker authority. Salespersons and associate brokers do not independently own commissions. Compensation belongs to the brokerage under Arizona law and brokerage agreements. Because of this, commission modifications, reductions, and special arrangements should always be approved by the designated broker or handled according to brokerage policy. This protects the licensee and ensures consistency throughout the brokerage. Disclosure creates trust. Throughout this course, we have emphasized disclosure as one of the most important agency principles. Compensation is no different. Buyers should understand how their broker is being paid. Sellers should understand what compensation they are agreeing to provide. Escrow should receive clear written instructions. The brokerage should maintain complete documentation. When everyone understands the arrangement, disputes become far less likely. The big lesson: modern agency practice requires agents to discuss compensation openly and document it carefully. The buyer-broker agreement establishes the relationship. The seller compensation addendum creates a method for the seller to contribute toward compensation. Any modifications should be approved by the broker and documented in writing. Most importantly, compensation should never be a surprise to anyone involved in the transaction. As we have seen throughout this course, the best agency relationships are built on communication, disclosure, and transparency. Compensation is simply another part of that conversation. When handled properly, it protects the buyer, the seller, the broker, and the transaction itself. Online discussion questions. Question 1. Why is the buyer-broker agreement important when discussing compensation? Answer. The buyer-broker agreement establishes the buyer's relationship with the broker and explains how compensation will be handled before properties are shown or offers are submitted. Question 2. What is the purpose of the seller compensation addendum? Answer. The addendum allows the seller and buyer to agree that the seller will pay compensation to the buyer's broker at closing and documents that agreement in writing. Question 3. Why should commission reductions always be documented? Answer. Documentation protects all parties, ensures escrow has accurate instructions, and confirms that the broker approved the modification.